Hey, this is Nick Tennant from Precision Extraction Solutions in Detroit, Michigan, and today you're listening to me on Professionally Cannabis.
Where do they go, the smoke rings I blow each night? Oh.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Professionally Cannabis Podcast. I'm Oscar Hausman, and I'm here with my co-host, Jonathan Weiser. Hey, Johnny, how are you doing?
I am very well, Oscar. How are you doing today?
You know what? I think I'm feeling like we're running out of summer, and it's a little bit sad, especially as this is probably going to be a winter unlike any I've had before. But maybe let's not dwell on the things we cannot change and focus on the beautiful harvest of podcasting. Sorry, that metaphor doesn't really make sense, but it is the harvest season. The beautiful harvest of podcast we have today for our audience. Johnny, can you tell them who we've got on the pod?
Absolutely. Yeah, so for today's podcast, we were joined by Nick Tennant. Now, he is the founder and CTO of Precision Extraction Solutions. Now, they are one of the leaders in cannabis extraction equipment, manufacturing and lab design. They're based out of Detroit, Michigan. They don't touch the plant. And all in all, they're a really, really interesting organization. I really enjoyed our chat with Nick, and I hope our listeners do too.
Well, Johnny, I'm sure our listeners will enjoy. So without further ado, let's cue the interview.
Where do they go, the smoke
Today, I'm
rings I
happy to
blow
say that we're
each
joined by
night?
Nick Tennant, founder and CTO of Precision Extraction Solutions, one of the leaders in cannabis extraction equipment manufacturing and lab design. Based out of Detroit, Michigan, it's 8 years since Nick built his first extraction prototype from his dining room table. We can't wait to hear about your journey since that day. Nick, welcome to the Professionally Cannabis Podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. My pleasure to be here.
Hi, Nick. So the question we ask all our guests, and I think it sounds like for you it'll have been a while ago, but what led you to the plant?
So, cannabis has always been in my life, but about, almost 15, 16 years ago now, I had family in California and Colorado, and they were involved in the industry back then. And so I was very close to them, and we kept in touch and really started to get into doing some things surrounding and related to cannabis around 2005 and 2006. And then Michigan, where I'm at in the United States, passed their law in 2008. So when they passed their law in 2008, we were very well prepared to execute. And we subsequently executed on many different business ventures, did well with them, and had a lot of exposure and gained a lot of knowledge base in the industry. And then 7 or 8 years ago, as you already kind of gave a prelude to, we moved towards the extraction market because we saw that as the future of everything. So we've been in the space for a significant period of time and basically gained just a lot of knowledge in every single niche in that time.
What were those other business ventures that you mentioned?
Yeah, so I've done everything. If there's a niche in the cannabis industry, I've played in it or consulted for somebody that was in it. So whether it's retail, we've done large commercial scale grow, indoor, outdoor, we've done hemp, we've done, edibles, we've done education and training courses. So we've done consulting, we've done analytical laboratories. I've touched every single aspect of the industry that I can really think of. We've worked with companies to do vertical integration, but ultimately we landed in extraction.
So let's talk about the lucre and the domination. How big is Precision Extracts? What sort of revenues or customer base do you have? How significant a player are you in this growing market?
Yeah, we're pretty large. I don't think our board probably would kick me if we publicly shared our revenue on a publication such as this or on a podcast openly. But I can tell you, so client base, thousands. We've done thousands of installations of our equipment. We have been around a pretty substantial period of time. And, when we started, there really wasn't much in the industry. But we grew from, just 4 guys in a warehouse to 65 employees and multiple offices serving some of the largest brands in the world, the largest cannabis brands, that is. So if you put in the ticker tape, or so to speak, the cannabis publicly traded list, and you look at that list, I'd say 70% of those guys are our clients, as well as many very significant, what we call multi-state operators in the United States. So because we have a state-by-state basis for our legislation and our laws in the United States, essentially what happens is if I start brand ABC in, for example, Michigan, and I want to take brand ABC to California, I subsequently have to build additional labs in each additional state, which is what we call multi-state operators. So some of these brands are doing expansion not only from multi-state, but multi-country, as you well know, which we're also serving, and also moving into the higher end production, such as pharmaceutical and isolation of certain compounds as well. So we have a vast amount of resources within our company. We continue to grow, and our revenue base continues to remain very strong.
There's a lot to digest there, and I'd love to come into both the international expansion and the pharmaceutical side of things later on in the interview. But let's start with the basics. So you've seen the whole space, but you decided that extraction was the piece of the pie that you most fancied. Can you talk us through why extraction makes sense?
So when you look at standardization of any product, cannabis is an amazing plant, but the genome of the cannabis plant is extremely diverse. And even if you are, for example, cloning a cutting from a mother plant and you're growing that clone, it's very hard to standardize the output production of that to, for example, like a good agricultural practices, or even to move to a manufactured product like a GMP type product. And the reason for that being is that, this plant gets more humidity, this plant gets more sun, this one, the mycorrhizae and the root system are a little bit different. The biological dynamics of the soil are a little bit different dynamic, and therefore, you get a different output of the plant. And when you cut cuttings off the mother, depending on where you cut them from, you're going to get different quality clones. Some clones are going to root faster, some are going to root slower. Ultimately, that's going to dictate somewhat on how it's grown. So you have this inherent inconsistency in the production of the plant. And ultimately, what that leads up to is a very, very good market for craft extracts, meaning if we're going to create small batch type craft extracts that have some variance between them from batch to batch, that's excellent for that. But if I'm a company that's making a vape pen, or I'm a company that's making a pharmaceutical, or I'm a company that's making any sort of product that needs standardization, we actually need to extract those relevant compounds, meaning the terpenoids, meaning the cannabinoids, the flavonoids, etc. We need to isolate those, and we need to standardize those compounds for re-injection back into, for example, a vape pen, an edible, etc., etc. So the standardization is really ultimately in every single product around the world. Okay, so if you look at, for example, Coca-Cola, you want Coca-Cola to taste like Coca-Cola every single time. They have their formulation down. These compounds and a formula that they put in is standardized. And it's essentially creating the same thing in cannabis. Now, we can sit here for days and I can make parallels to multiple different consumable industries on the standardization of a particular product. But what's important is that you can create that standardization through extraction. So that's the first thing, and why I thought it was the future trend of everything, because you see all these other parallels in the other industries. The second thing is really being able to take a low quality product and turn it into a high quality product. There's a very good value dynamic there. So if a crop gets mold, mildew, pesticides, if it just isn't a good yield, if the bud doesn't come out good, this can all be remediated through extraction, distillation, through refinement, isolation of these individual molecules, and ultimately have a standardized, purified product free of any adulterants. So this is another aspect of why we thought, extraction was going to be great, and it's also why it continues to be great. And then the third aspect is just actual diversity in the products that you can create. So the diversity in the products that you can create is profound. I mean, if you think about it just off the top of my head, like shatter, butter, wax, live resin, topicals, vape pens, edibles, tinctures, you could go on and on and on about the products that you could create from extracted standardized extracts. And so those three key levers is what I really saw 7 or 8 years ago. And that's what led us to the extraction space. And lo and behold, most markets when we started were 90%, I say 90% flower, 90% flower sales. And now you've got more progressive markets. You see numbers anywhere from 50-50 extract to flower. You see some markets more progressive being even closer to 70% extracts, with the mean average in the United States being about 62% of sales coming from extract.
So as an organization, are you guys directly touching the plant, or are you selling up your equipment, setting up your equipment for folks that are doing that themselves?
Yeah, we're a non-plant touching entity besides for our, testing and R&D, which we have partnered companies that we work with that are fully licensed entities. So Precision itself is a non-plant touching entity. You can think of us like the Apple of extraction. What we do is we have a lot of really sharp engineers. We have a lot of really sharp R&D and technical people. We ultimately design these solutions. We design these products for the isolation of these cannabinoids and ultimately develop and manufacture our products through an outsourced and robust supply chain, much like Apple does. And then we ultimately final assembly, test, market, ensure that everything is meeting the standards that are applicable to our equipment.
How much of a consideration was setting up Precision in a way that you were non-plant touching after your first few ventures in the cannabis industry? I imagine you've rolled out your first few ventures, you've got to grips with the complexity of the regulatory environment and thought, we can avoid this? Or how did it play out for you guys?
Yeah, I mean, that was a big part of it. Early in the days of cannabis, it was very precarious, legally precarious. So, you didn't know what was going to happen. So there was definitely, I wouldn't say necessarily trauma in my head, but there was definitely that sense of the piano is hanging over your head and it could drop at any given time. That really didn't get alleviated until I'd say, 2016, somewhere around 2016 is when you started to really feel safe when the movement, at least in the United States, got a substantial amount of momentum and therefore provided more of a level of certainty. So operating in a non-plant touching niche was great for us. The second thing about the non-plant touching niche is it does open us up for investment. So we're constantly talking to many different investors. We're constantly entertaining conversations from different private equity groups. 99% of these don't work out. We've actually only done one round of investment our entire history of our company, but that doesn't mean that we're not open to collaborative and strategic conversations. So when these companies find out that you're a non-plant touching entity, all of a sudden it makes it a lot safer for them to play in, whether they're a publicly traded company or whether they're like a private equity group. Either way, the institutional investor base has a increased level of certainty, I would say, surrounding the legal safety of not manufacturing the actual substance or not touching the leaf, as we say.
They prefer the picks and the shovels, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great analogy. We use that commonly. The picks and shovel analogy is a great one to use.
So there's something around there that I wanted to ask you about. I was looking at you talking through on a promotional video for one of your pieces of technology, the Vulcan, I believe the name is, but the one that can process tons of biomatter in a single day. And I just wanted to get an understanding of how many players are there that are actually using machinery on such a scale? And perhaps this leads into your international ambitions, but is there anywhere else in the world other than North America that are taking those sort of volumes through the process?
I think that there will be. So we had this strange, market dynamic in the last, say, 12 to 18 months in the United States because we had the legalization of hemp. So that really catalyzed the market in terms of extraction and the actual volumes that were going to be processed. So now, subsequent to that, there's been a substantial correction, or I would just say coming back to reality in the hemp market. So there's a handful of players that are processing at that volume in the United States. And maybe there's a handful also that are doing it at a volume of, we'll say, greater than 5,000 pounds a day of actual THC in cannabis. As that relates to larger global market, I think that there's tremendous demand globally for large scale production and centralized production. And ultimately, it'll drive that way to some degree. You already have these large Canadian entities looking at growing mass amounts in Colombia and some of the South American area there, just because they can grow it year round, they can grow it outside, it's low cost of production, they can extract it and put it in 55-gallon drums, and they have federal legalization, so they can import it back into Canada. And if you look at the per pound production cost, or however you want to look at the value dynamics, it's substantially, obviously, lower to do that in South America and do centralized production than it is to do large greenhouse infrastructure within the jurisdiction of the Canadian provinces. So you're going to see a lot more of that international import, export, and centralization of production start globally. But that's a long-term play. And that's also, kind of, I would say it's limited by the dynamic of how these countries are going to write their legislation and allow for federal import and export of these products. And particularly the big catalyst to that will be the EU and how they kind of put that together because, you've got I think 750 million people living or somewhere around there in the EU and pretty high consumption rate from the initial data that's coming out. So those dynamics will kind of all play together and eventually it'll sort itself out, but centralization will definitely take place.
Nick, so you mentioned earlier that as an organization and in your professional life, Precision doesn't touch the plant. I kind of wanted to take it onto a different tack and ask if that's the same in your personal life. And if you do touch the plant in your personal life, what do you like? What sort of cannabis products appeal to you outside of work?
Yeah, so I'm a very rare cannabis user, very rare user of anything that affects my mind. I love botanicals. I love plants. I love isolating particular compounds from botanicals. And if you look at this area of research, like I have a fundamental belief that the universe has given us every single compound that we need to remain healthy, thrive, heal ourselves, whatever it is. And if you look at some of these, whether they're terpenoids or flavonoids or whatever they are from all botanicals on Earth, these compounds can be isolated and they can ultimately do a favor to humanity in terms of creating a better overall human health. So for me, I'm very centrally focused around holistic health, and I do love cannabis, but my body just doesn't respond well to adulterants, whether it's toxins or chemicals or anything like that. So I try to generally limit, my wine consumption, my cannabis consumption, and we're talking, very seldom occasions, maybe, once a month or something like that, that I even drink wine or even smoke. So the flip side of that is I think that it gives me a substantial competitive dynamic because my brain is just switched on all the time, which I think would drive some people insane, but that's just the way I'm wired. And I don't know, I feel pretty good most times, most all the time, really. So I do have a lot of friends that use cannabis, I do use on occasion, but I'm, never, I like to have the clear head. I like to have a clear thinking dynamic, and I like waking up refreshed and ready to conquer the day. And whether it's wine, or any other adulterants, I just generally, personally, not for me, just doesn't give me the good feeling that it does with a lot of people. And I know a lot of people are the complete opposite. And some of my friends, they smoke a copious amount of cannabis and they're still really sharp and execute on what they need to do really, really well also. But I'm just not one of those people. It just doesn't, my genome it doesn't match up really well.
How about the non-psychoactive cannabinoids? Because as you say, the plant's got many different interesting and therapeutic substances within.
Yeah, absolutely. So, terpenoids and the flavonoids and stuff like that, I'm a big believer in that for just general immune health, general function of the body. And with the CBD and so forth, I've tried CBD, I've used it on occasion. I don't really feel anything. I don't know if my body's just, that's how it is. It will take away pain. I'll tell you that. Like if you put those topical creams on with CBD and, you're sore from the gym or you hurt yourself or whatever it is, that works like a charm. And I've used that on occasion several times. With CBD ingesting, I don't have trouble sleeping. I don't have trouble really with anything. So I don't really have any ailments that need adjustment, so to speak. And therefore, I've tried it, but, not really a big consumer of the non-psychoactive cannabinoids. In terms of, the flavonoids and the terpenoids and things like that, I'm a big, big proponent of the flavonoids and terpenoids and the other compounds within cannabis, of course, which is a huge producer of those terpenoids, but also within other plants. So one of my passions is I grow a lot of different high terpenoid and high flavonoid plants, and I grow those literally at my house and in my yard. I have a huge garden. And I think that, the closer that you are to the earth, the more that you're ingesting these cannabinoids, flavonoids, terpenoids, all these different compounds, phytochemicals, we call them, from plants. Ultimately, the healthier you will be. And cannabis plays a big role in that for a lot of people. And there's a substantial, irrefutable amount of evidence that it works really, really well for a lot of people. So again, this whole connection to the earth, the connection to the universe, the connection to the plant, it's something that, was put here for us. And I truly believe that in my heart and soul, which makes me extremely passionate about working with the plant, even though I'm not I would say, a habitual consumer. I'm an occasional consumer. But again, it does a lot for a lot of people, and that can't be ignored.
So in a sense, with your garden, you do touch the plant, but not this plant.
Yeah. Well, I may have some of this plant too in some gardens also. So yeah, but absolutely. I touch many plants, again, like botany and horticulture. Just always passionate about that, and understanding, the dynamics of plants is amazing.
So you're really driven to this by sort of a thoughtful view on the market and what's occurring. So, and I take that from the fact that you were looking at extraction when the world was looking at flower. So I guess, what's your views for how the market's going to evolve, and where will cannabis and conversations like this be in 5 or 10 years' time down the line?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing, right, to try to predict this, but I guess I'm in the better spot than most. So I think that really cannabis is going to play a fundamental role in curing, treating a lot of disease, because we understand how these cannabinoids interact with the endocannabinoid system, with the central nervous system. We understand the positive physical benefit or positive health benefit that can occur from the consumption of cannabis and cannabinoids. I think what you're going to see is more standardization. So not necessarily moving towards pharmaceutical, but moving towards what we call good manufacturing practice, because I think that that's absolutely paramount in creating these extracts, is having some sort of standardization of production. And then globally, we will see an expansion. We'll see more legalization. We'll see more centralization. We'll see more larger cannabis companies coming in. I mean, if we look at the predictions, if we look at like ArcView or New Frontier and look at their research analytics, you can see that some of these numbers they're putting out for just EU and American market is like $250 billion between 2025 and 2028 for the overall market size, which is about 10 times what it is right now. A little bit more than that. But really, it's going to be a freight train that I don't believe can be stopped. I think that you have a drastic change in public and social opinion, which is going to be very hard to overturn, if not impossible at this point. So the freight train continues. And, it's just a matter of really getting these individual jurisdictions to pass their legislations and get these legislations moving the way they need to sort of proceed in a way that is going to push this entire industry forward. And once they can do that, that just creates more momentum. It's like the snowball effect. At this point, the snowball is rolling downhill and it just keeps picking up more snow. And I don't think that there's anything that can really stop that snowball. And just because people are waking up to, hey, this is a plant. It is, as we've said this whole podcast, it is put here by the universe. It can treat human disease and ailment. It can create a drastically higher quality of life for many, many people. So that's irrefutable. And I think that most people are woken to that fact, so to speak. And it's going to be very hard, if not impossible, to overturn. So I'm overwhelmingly optimistic about the future state of this industry, and not only the business dynamics, the financial dynamics, but also the dynamics of creating new, super cool, innovative products that can create a better quality of life for mankind.
I totally agree with the snowball. I mean, we've got all these current disease states that are being treated, and they're not going to be less treated in future. We'll just discover more disease states which can be treated with cannabis. So there's really only room for growth, at least in the medical side of things. But I guess you could make similar arguments about the consumer. We're running up to the end of our time together, so I think we've probably got time for one or two more questions. I think, well, we've actually already asked you a question that we tend to like ending the show on, which is about your personal preferences within the cannabis space. So I guess, could we talk a bit about what do you think cannabis has done in North America on a more societal level, perhaps rather than on an individual level? Do you think that the cannabis revolution has affected other parts of society and culture?
Well, that's a great question. Undeniably, yes, it's definitely affected society. I think that it's opened people's eyes to the fact that there are a lot of natural treatments for health conditions, and those can come from botanicals. But it's also, I think, created more of a tolerance also for many things. Generally, the ideology of those that support cannabis is one that's substantially more tolerant to many things. Now, it's a crazy world that we live in these days, but if you had to ask, is cannabis overall a net positive or net negative effect for mankind as a whole? The answer is overwhelmingly it's a net positive. And again, going back to the natural earth, the universe, how things are tied together, it's a plant that was put here. It's put here for a reason, and I don't want to necessarily say fate or anything like that, but it's interesting how we're watching the dynamic of this plant shape, global social opinion, how we're watching it shape an industry, how we're watching it shape people's minds in order to have a different dynamic of thinking towards how we treat and prevent disease and ailment. So I think it's a extremely, extremely moving and captivating plant. And if you look at the culture also, the people that are really in cannabis, I mean, that's all they do. They're diehard cannabis. I mean, everything in their life surrounds cannabis, which is amazing. And I'm partially one of those people, I guess from a different angle, but it's all consuming. So I think overall net positive benefit to society as a whole.
Well, thank you very much for that answer. I think that's a great note to finish on. Nick, thank you for joining us on Professionally Cannabis.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you guys for having me.
Where do they go? The smoke rings I blow each night.
Well, I love that interview, and certainly the energy at the end. I always find it fascinating when operators in a legal state don't consume the plant themselves. And especially in Nick's case, he's driven more by the pure science and a fundamental belief in what it can do. I don't know, just something about that tickles me the right way.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But as someone that perhaps doesn't touch this plant so much, but is a plant touching and horticultural and botanical person, he's certainly someone that we see eye to eye with. And listener, if you enjoyed this podcast or any of the others in our series, we would ask you, of course, please to support the pod by subscribing, sharing the pod with a friend or colleague, and dropping us a nice comment if at all possible. In the meantime, it's been great speaking with you. And until next week, see you later.
Hello, please take me above, take me with you.